Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really happy to be here. So what I'm going to do is give I think, a fairly general level talk about how I see the doing, allowing, and the intending, foreseeing distinctions as being important for a certain type of ethics. I've got lots to say about how we can justify the doing, allowing distinction, but I'm not going to kind of go into detail about that in this talk, but really happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So what I want to try and argue in this talk is that we need deontological distinctions. We need both the distinction between doing and allowing and something like the distinction between intending and merely foreseeing. And when I say we, what I mean is anybody who doesn't want to be a consequentialist. So if you're a consequentialist, somebody who believes that all that matters is what the outcome of an act will be, then you don't really need deontological distinctions. But if you want to argue that we should not be consequentialists, that some things are impermissible even if they would produce the best consequences, then I think you need deontological distinctions. To be more precise, at least one such distinction is needed for a genuine alternative to consequentialism. And I think actually we need both the distinction between doing and allowing and something like the distinction between intending and merely foreseeing to have plausible implications about cases. So the plan is to start off by saying, why do we need deontological distinctions? Then to look at the doing, allowing distinction and the double effect, or the distinction between intending and foreseeing, and ask whether these are sisters or rivals, and argue that they are in fact sisters, mutually supportive principles rather than rival principles that should be competing. And then I'll give a little bit more detail about the doctrine of double effect, or the distinction between strictly intended and merely foreseen harm. So let's start off. Why deontological distinctions? Well, consequentialism is often criticized on the basis of apparent counterexamples. So these are cases in which it seems as if consequentialism gets the answer wrong. So a very common example is the rioting mob case. So in this case, a crime has been committed, and the people are about to riot. The sheriff knows that he could frame and execute an innocent man, which would stop the riot. This would have the best consequences because it would mean one innocent person would die, but a great many innocent lives would be saved, because otherwise these will be lost in the riot. And so it looks as if consequentialism tells us that the sheriff should execute the innocent man. This is because consequentialism says you should perform whichever act would produce the best consequences, and it seems as if the act that would produce the best consequences is executing the innocent man. Now, one response, in fact, Philippa Foot says that act consequentialism has the implication that there's nothing it will not be right to do to a perfectly innocent individual if that's the only way of preventing another agent from doing more things of the same kind. And Foot says, now I find this a totally unacceptable conclusion, and note it is a conclusion not of utilitarianism in particular, but rather of consequentialism in any form. So it doesn't matter, Foot's saying it doesn't matter how we rate sets of outcomes. If we have any view on which all that matters is producing the best outcome, we're going to end up with these totally unacceptable conclusions. So a common way, or one way, that consequentialists can respond to these objections is by arguing that consequentialism tells us to do something, and intuitively that's the wrong answer, but that we should reject our intuitions here. This is known as the biting the bullet. So J.J.C. Smart gives what I think of as the myopia and moral squeamishness response. So Smart says, if it's really true that the harm that you would cause by executing the innocent man would be much, much less than the harm that you would prevent by preventing the riot, then it should give us just as much anguish to think about the harm that we would prevent. In fact, it should cause us more anguish to think about not preventing that harm as it should to think about executing the innocent man. So executing an innocent man is a terrible thing to do, Smart says. It's awful that this innocent person will die, but it's even more awful if more innocent people die when we could have prevented them. And Smart says that the refusal to act in this type of case is a case of moral squeamishness. Smart says the case is analogous to one in which I might have the knowledge to perform a life-saving operation, but in which I just could not bring myself to cut into human flesh. Smart also accuses us of a kind of moral myopia, moral short-sightedness. So we're focusing too much on the harm that we would cause, and this is looming very large to us, but we're not seeing the terrible harms that will happen if we don't act to prevent them. And he thinks this is a kind of a short-sightedness. We're not seeing things in their true, not seeing them truly. Instead, we're seeing some things as larger and clearer than they really are. So why is all this important? Well, I think that to respond to Smart, what we need is to say, we're not suffering from moral short-sightedness. We're not suffering from moral myopia. We're not seeing some things as larger than they really are. Instead, it's true that we should be more bothered by the harm that would happen if we executed an innocent man, the harm to the innocent man, than the harm from the other innocent people whose deaths we would merely allow. So what we need is a deontological distinction. So if we think about all the action, all the outcomes, all the consequences of an action, we need to be able to argue that they're not all kind of equally important. We have a special responsibility or should be specially concerned about some of them. So we need something like the doctrine of doing and allowing. So the doctrine of doing and allowing says, other things being equal, allowing harm is easier to justify than doing harm, or doing harm is harder to justify than allowing harm. So there are special constraints against doing harm. And because of those constraints, harm that you would do should appear larger and clearer to you. The other main alternative is the doctrine of double effect, the claim that other things being equal, harm that is merely foreseen is easier to justify than harm that's strictly intended. And again, this doctrine would seem to provide a response to Smart. we should be more concerned with the death of the innocent man, because that harm would be strictly intended. And there are stronger constraints against strictly intending harm to someone than merely foreseeing that harm will occur, as we do in the case of the deaths caused by the riot. So I think we need these deontological distinctions in order to be able to respond to smart. In fact, I think that we need them in order to have a non-consequentialist ethics at all. So consequentialist ethics say values are to be promoted. Whatever is good, we want there to be as much of that as possible. And whatever is bad, we want there to be as little of that as possible. So if we think that pleasure or happiness is good, we want as much happiness as possible. And if we think pain is bad, then we want as little pain as possible. Now, non-consequentialists reject that. And it can be hard to see how can we reject the claim that we should, if something is good, we want as much of it as possible. Well, I think really the way to reject consequentialism is to say there are some values where the right response to them is not to promote them, not to make there be as much of that valuable thing as possible. There are values that should be respected rather than promoted. So an example here might be that honesty, the value of honesty, requires us to avoid lying, even when that's the best way to promote truth-telling. So if you think, I really, really care about the truth, I really care about honesty, so I'll be prepared to tell a lie if that's going to prevent other people from lying, if that's going to produce the most true beliefs. But if we're going to say that, then we actually require a distinction between telling a lie yourself and countenancing lies. So we need a deontological distinction. We need to pick out some of the outcomes of your behavior and say, these matter more, these are special. Otherwise, so we need that in order just to make sense of when you count as lying and when you count as merely countenancing an untruth. So we need the ontological distinctions to have this difference between respecting and promoting values, which is really the heart of non-consequentialism. Okay, so that's the first bit. My argument that we do need these deontological distinctions if we don't want to be forced into consequentialist ethics. I've said that we need either something like the doctrine of doing and allowing, or the distinction between strictly intended and merely foreseen harm. Now, some people think of these as rivals. So we want one deontological distinction to rule them all. And the doing, allowing distinction and the distinction between strictly intended and merely foreseen harm are kind of competing to be the best distinction, the only distinction that we need. I think that's a mistake. But let's look a little bit closer about why people might think that. Now, one common reason why people kind of think we need the doctrine of double effect and the doctrine of doing and allowing. So the doctrine of double effect just is the claim that the distinction between what's strictly intended and what's merely foreseen matters. So quite often when we're discussing this, we are thinking about trolleys. One of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy is Judith Jarvis Thompson's trolley case. which I kind of call the bystander trolley case to distinguish it from other trolley cases. Now, in this very famous case, we have a runaway trolley that's heading towards 5 people who are trapped on the track in front of it. If nothing happens, we can see that the trolley will hit those 5 people and kill them. A bystander is out for a walk, sees that this is the situation, and also that there is a switch that bystander can pull, turning it onto a side track where 1 person is trapped. Now, the trolley problem is, why is it permissible to turn the trolley? The general assumption when we talk about trolleys is that people are going to say, yes, it's okay to turn the trolley. It's permissible to turn the trolley. But this is puzzling because normally we don't think it's okay to kill 1 person to save 5. So if you're a doctor, in this one famous case is the organs case. In this case, a doctor has 5 patients who all need organ transplants of different organs, and the doctor finds a patient who comes in to have their ingrowing toenails seen to, and they're a match for all these 5 people. So the doctor could kill that patient, take the organs, and give them to the 5. We don't think that's permissible. We don't think it's permissible to kill 1 person to save 5 in that case. There are also trolley type cases where it seems it's not permissible to kill 1 person to save 5. So if instead of being on a track, the bystander, instead of being, so that in the bridge case, we have a single track, the trolley is heading towards the 5 people, and the bystander and the other person are on a bridge above the trolley. The other person is a very large person. They're large enough that if the bystander pushed them in front of the trolley, then they could bring the trolley to a halt, saving the 5 people. Bystander can't jump in front of the trolley themselves because they're not big enough to stop the trolley. And most people say, no, you can't push the person off the bridge to stop the trolley. So it looks as if generally we don't think it's permissible to kill 1 person to save 5, but it does seem permissible in the bystander trolley case. You have this trolley, it's heading towards 5 people. You could redirect it so it would kill fewer people. It seems very clear to many people that that would be at least permissible. So people see the trolley case as a counterexample to the doctrine of doing and allowing, the claim that doing harm is harder to justify than merely allowing harm. I don't think it is. And I think we can see that if we just adjust the harm. So I have a version of the trolley called One Life and an Arm. And in this case, we have 1 person, 2 people trapped on the main track. One of these people is not fully on the track. So if the trolley's not turned, 1 person will die and 1 person will lose an arm. And I think it's clearly not permissible to turn the trolley in this case. Also note it's not permissible to turn the trolley if there's just 1 person on each track. And that suggests that doing harm is harder to justify than merely allowing harm. We don't think that you should kill 1 person to save 1 person plus 1 arm, even in this, even in a trolley case. So what I think is going on here is that both the distinction between doing and allowing and some other distinction matter. So the one life and one arm trolley shows that the doing allowing distinction matters. But the bystander trolley case shows that the doing allowing distinction is not the only distinction that matters, because we need something else to explain the permissibility of turning the trolley in the trolley case. And the trolley case isn't an isolated case. There are quite a lot of cases which have also show this pattern. It's just the most famous case. Now, I say we need the doing allowing distinction and something like the intended foreseen distinction. And the reason that I say that is that I'm pretty sure that the doing allowing distinction is the distinction that we need to explain why it's not permissible to turn the trolley in the one life and an arm case. But I'm not sure whether the intended foreseen distinction is the distinction that we need to explain why it is permissible to turn the trolley in the bystander trolley case and not in the organs, and it's not permissible to push the man off the bridge in the bridge case, or take the organs in the organ case. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about the intended foreseen distinction, partly because I think this distinction it's not as kind of easy to grasp as the distinction between having done something and having merely allowed something. So a bit more detail on the doctrine of double effect. So the doctrine of double effect says, other things being equal, harm that's merely foreseen is easier to justify than harm that's strictly intended. It focuses on the distinction between harm that you strictly intend and harm that you merely foresee. However, we have to be very careful in applying this, because to strictly intend harm is something different from other uses of intentional and unintentional. So sometimes you might bump into somebody and they might say, "Ow, you hurt me." And you would say, "I'm sorry, that was not intended, that was unintentional." That's not the distinction that we're pointing to now. That's another sense of something not being intended. Instead, the distinction between what's strictly intended and what's merely foreseen really relies on a sense of, or on the idea of there being things that you aim for as either your end or the means to your end. Where the end here is your goal, the thing that you're trying to achieve. The means to your end is the way that you will achieve your goal. So the method by which you will achieve your goal. So something is strictly intended when it's intended either as an end or as a means to an end. And it's merely foreseen when it is a foreseen side effect of your behavior, but it's not intended either as an end or as a means to an end. So whenever we act in order to achieve something, there are things which are part of the plan, and there are things which are merely side effects. For example, you might be walking to the shops to buy bread, and as you walk, you will probably make a pleasing rhythmic noise with your feet. But the pleasing rhythmic noise is not something that's intended either as an end or as a means to an end. It's just a side effect. You don't really care about the rhythm of your noise, sorry, the rhythmic noise that you're making. What you want to do is to walk there and get to the shop. I tend to think that the good way, so I have a kind of flow chart for working out whether something is an end, a means, or merely foreseen. So first we say, is it your ultimate goal? And if you say yes, then that is an end. If you say no, then, then we have to ask, do you need the harm to occur for your plan to work? And if you say yes, then the harm is a means to your end, and so forth, strictly intended. But if you say, no, I don't need that harm to occur, it's merely foreseen. So in the bystander trolley case, I like to imagine that the person on the sidetrack somehow, breaks free and starts to climb up out of the track. Now, how does the bystander respond to that? Do they get a kind of pole and start poking at the one person, trying to get them to skip back on the track? Or do they offer their hand and help pull that one person out of the track? Well, in the bystander case, they're happy. It's not any part of their plan that the person on the sidetrack should be hit by the trolley. All they want to do is to redirect the trolley down that sidetrack. And if they can do that, and the person on the sidetrack can still escape, they're pleased. It's good. It doesn't affect the plan in any way. In contrast, if we think about the bridge case, remember in the bridge case, the bystander has pushed the large person onto the track because their body will bring the trolley to a halt before it hits the 5. If that large person starts to climb out of the track, the bystanders' plans are ruined. They will have to push them back down for their plan to succeed. So we can see the difference between the role that the innocent person plays in the bystander trolley case and the role that the large person plays in the bridge case. In the bridge case, the person's death is part of the plan. In the bystander trolley case, it's not part of the plan, it's just a side effect. Now, the doctrine of double effect isn't a kind of arbitrary response to the trolley problem, because it's a long-standing principle used in medical ethics and just war theory. Lots of different areas we seem to need a distinction between kind of collateral damage and harm that is strictly intended. And it also seems that there is something particularly bad in using someone in a way that harms them, in having harm to somebody be something that you're aiming at, something that's part of your plan. However, the doctrine of double effect does face some really serious problems. One problem is that it seems kind of peculiar that whether your behavior is permissible should depend on what's inside your head. So in one case, we might imagine, a bomber going to the prime minister or going to his commander to say, can I bomb this factory? And the commander has to say, well, let me think about what your intentions would be. It doesn't seem as if examining what a person is kind of thinking should affect whether their behavior is permissible. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes intentions do matter. So, for example, as a lecturer, if I'm marking papers, it's important for me to know that I have given a paper the mark that I've given it because of facts about how good the paper is rather than because of my feelings about the student. And in other cases, our intentions can have a kind of symbolic meaning. But it seems that generally, whether it's permissible to do something should depend upon kind of external facts about the what we would be doing rather than what we would be thinking while we're doing it. Another problem is that the doctrine of double effect seems kind of vulnerable to, well, it's not clear that it gets the right answer in all cases. Because sometimes we don't actually need the harm. We just need things to happen to a person that inevitably lead to the harm. So maybe you could say, look, I don't want the large person to get hurt by the trolley. I just want them to be hit by the trolley and to bring the trolley to a halt. If they, as soon as they've been hit by the trolley, I'm going to be running down with my med kit to, try and cure them, heal them. And sometimes this is put to a sort of a problem with like being able to weasel out of things. But I think it's more than that, because I think there's actually a genuine worry here. Even if we suppose that everybody's being very sincere, they're genuinely trying to work out whether the behavior would be permissible, there seem to be questions about exactly what do you intend. If you say, well, you have to intend the person's death because you know they can't be hit by the trolley without being killed, then it seems that that's also going to be true in the bystander case. You know that you can't turn the trolley without it hitting the innocent person trapped on the side track. Which suggests that at least there needs to be some kind of modification of the doctrine of double effect if it's going to work. And there have been various proposals put forward for how we should modify the doctrine of double effect to kind of deal with these problems, but it's not clear to me that there is a single kind of obvious, this is the answer. So that's all the three things that I wanted to do today. I've argued that we need some kind of deontological distinctions if we're not going to be consequentialists. I've argued that the doctrine of double effect and the doctrine of doing and allowing are mutually supportive principles that work together rather than rivals competing. We need both of them. Well, we need the doctrine of doing and allowing and something like the doctrine of double effect. And I've discussed a little bit in more detail exactly what the doctrine of double effect is, and explained why we might worry that it's not the right thing, even if it's in the right area. So we need something like the doctrine of double effect, but maybe not the doctrine of double effect itself. Okay, and now I think, I do have a final slide. Time for discussion. I can't hear anybody, but I don't know if that's a me problem. Shall I stop? I'll stop sharing. Oh dear.
Helen, your audio doesn't work. But I think David has a question.
Yes. It seems to me that there is something that we need in analyzing these moral problems, which is a clear definition of what an action is and what the boundaries around a given action are. And I haven't been able to find that in the philosophical literature, actually, what is a unit action, because that makes a difference to analyzing these double effect problems. Maybe I just haven't been looking at the right places, Donald Davidson and so forth, but I don't find anywhere that says, where do you draw a line to say this is a unit action? And what I think one could use very old-fashioned terminology like, I mean, an action obviously includes intention, but it's not only intention in many cases. So it has as it were, often a material side. And where do you draw the boundaries around that? I don't know if anyone knows any literature on how you define an action, a unit action.
I don't think that most of the discussion has been put in those terms.
I agree.
But I think I see it as kind of the same question. So Jonathan Bennett, for example, puts his discussion of what he calls the making allowing distinction in terms of when you count as fying for some verb, phi, and when you count as allowing something to happen. So when do you count as hitting, and when do you count as allowing a hit to occur? So he's interested in these sort of the transitive, sorry, he's interested in these verbs where the outcome becomes part of how we describe what somebody has done in this sort of direct way. So the big example is, what is the difference? When do you count as having killed somebody? And when do you count as having merely allowed somebody to die? And I think the reason I think it's the same question is because the question is, when do we put the death into your action? When do we see it as part of your action rather than simply as a further outcome of your action, or as something in which your action is sort of merely a condition? So do you think that's the same? I mean, it seems to me it's at least sort of in the right area.
It's vaguely in the target area, but it's too imprecise really to provide what I'm looking for, I think.
I mean, one thing.
So you might say if you do something like throwing the fat man over to stop the trolley, how do you define that action? Is the death of the person part of the essence of the action or not? Is it? It's obviously not a final cause, but is it a material cause, to use that Aristotelian terminology that doesn't work that badly for this? So it might be that first you have to define what your action is before you proceed to talk about indirect effects, etc. So I can see that the Bennett line is groping around for the same sort of thing, but I don't think it's put its finger on it. No.
Can you say a little bit more about why you think that's the question to ask? Because I guess, okay, maybe I'll just say a little bit more about why I think it might not be the right question to ask. So I worry that question is going to be kind of bringing together or kind of so in my view, we have two distinctions at least that matter here: the distinction between doing harm and allowing harm, and the distinction between what's strictly intended and what's merely foreseen. And I think they both matter. And my worry is that if you put it in terms of what's included in the action, you get something that's sort of blurring those things, and also including other things which we might not want to include. So, for example, suppose that the bystander doesn't actually push the large man off the bridge himself. Instead, what the bystander does is they pay somebody else to do it. Now, we wouldn't usually say that we wouldn't say he pushed the fat man off the bridge. We wouldn't say he killed the fat man. We might say he brought it about that the fat man was killed. And yet it seems to me that there would be exactly the same moral objections to pushing the fat man off the bridge to paying somebody to push the fat man off the bridge as there would be to pushing the fat man off the bridge yourself.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it would be just like, whether you pay a hitman to kill somebody or whether you shoot them yourself. I agree. That would be the same thing. I can see that this doesn't slide easily into your two distinctions, but it doesn't mean it's incompatible with them. I think it actually would help, because when people analyze action, okay, the intention, everyone is very clear-headed about it, but then there's often more to the morality of an action than intention. I mean, intention alone can make an action bad, but there are some actions which are bad irrespective of intention. So that's where you need to say what is the action, what are the borders of the action. I don't know any literature on it.
I'm just
I don't think it's incompatible with your two distinctions.
Yeah,
but I think you'd need to think a bit to see how they fit all together. But
yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'm a sort of skeptic about there being borders to actions in a useful way. So I think there are really important questions about how the kind of constraints line up with facts about our behavior and what kind of relationships to harm are particularly important. But I'm not really sure about the sort of how important it is to ask what is actually part of the action and what is a further consequence, given that the further consequences, I mean, because you might think what's really important here is a sort of, okay, so one thing that matters is what are we going to actually, what is too distant from actions for us to care about at all? So there's this paralysis problem that Will MacAskill puts forward, and the idea there is that if you think that doing harm is worse than merely allowing harm, you should never do anything at all, because every time you do anything, far down the line, you are going to be relevant to things in a positive way, rather than in a merely allowing way. There are multiple, there are just so many consequences, so many things that you bring about every time you act. And so MacAskill thinks that's just going to show that there's always going to be something that's harmful. There are always going to be harmful things that you bring about. And so if we think that it's worse to bring about harm than to merely allow harm, you just should try not have any consequences to your actions. Now, there are various problems with that argument, but I think one thing that it does show is that we don't count all of the very distant consequences when we're thinking about the consequences of our behavior. We have a kind of limited sphere of things that we kind of take to be relevant. And one thing is foreseeability. And so that, I think, is an important question. What is kind of what out of all the possible infinite consequences of your actions are actually kind of in the sphere of concern? And then I think there are more specific questions about, you know, particular constraints against particular ways of being relevant to harm to people, which in my view really come down to the relationship, the objections to standing in certain relationships to people. And so I think you might see that I'm sort of I'm kind of skeptical about where the question about the boundaries of the action gets its, whether there really is such a thing as the boundaries of an action, or whether it's just it's sort of a matter of how we describe things. And then also whether if there was, it would be something that mattered after you described all the other stuff that I think does matter. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see that you're not keen on the idea, yes.
Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Apologies for that. Bruce, I think you were the next.
Thanks, Fiona, for a really interesting talk. It was really good. I like the way you explained the distinction between the bystander with the switch and the bridge by you know, intention and whether the death is part of the plan or not. But what I wonder is that there seems to be a threshold for these distinctions where it doesn't make any difference. And once we get to more extreme situations where there's a large number of deaths, we just collapse into consequentialism anyway. Maybe you could just talk about that.
Good. Yeah. So I'm mentioning McCaskill again, actually, because they have a really great site, which is objections to is on utilitarianism. It's utilitarianism.net, and they go through all the kind of objections to utilitarianism and possible responses. And this is actually one of their responses from utilitarians, and it's a dilemma. So basically, if we're gonna say these distinctions matter, then we have the question of, are they absolute? So is it the case that you should never do harm or never intentionally do harm, which would be the kind of worst of the worst, no matter how many people you could save, no matter what the consequences? Or is there some kind of number of people? Is there some point at which the consequences are so bad that we should be prepared to do basically anything? All bets are off. All deontological distinctions are unimportant. And I think it is a really bad dilemma, because if there is somewhere where at some time when they become unimportant, when we start to act like consequentialists, we have this kind of arbitrariness problem. Why then? Why not? Is it the case that there's some number, and if you have one less than that number of lives at stake, it really matters whether you're intending harm or foreseeing harm? And if you have one more death, that makes the difference. And that's just, it seems very counterintuitive. Now, my own response to this is that we should be non-absolutists. So I think there are situations where things get bad enough that you should be prepared to intentionally kill one person to prevent that. However, we should not be, you know, that's recognizing that kind of in principle this could happen. It's recognizing a kind of a logically possible situation. And that's not to say that there are any actual cases in the world where that happens. So that's one thing. In fact, I think it's very important for it's very important that in things like war, we don't adopt a kind of anything goes attitude. It's very, very easily to persuade yourself that what's at stake is so important that you can do anything to achieve it. And I don't think that, I think that kind of is that way madness lies. But my answer to the kind of the kind of vagueness, arbitrariness worry is that actually there is moral vagueness. So there is no sharp point at which suddenly it becomes okay. Instead, there's going to be a borderline, an area where it's not clear. It's in fact indeterminate whether it's permissible, what it's permissible to do. And I think if you're ever in those situations, that's a really kind of morally tragic situation to be in. It's horrible to be in a situation where morality, where we've gone beyond kind of certainty. But I think the arbitrary, the idea of a kind of line, one more death, that makes it okay, is implausible. And so I think that we do have to just accept that there is some indeterminacy in ethics. And what we have is, it does matter. I think it always matters whether harm is intended or merely, well, whatever that distinction is. And I think it always matters whether you do harm or merely allow harm. But in some cases, it might be that the consequences matter more. And of course, what you end up with is, as the consequences get more and more awful, it becomes, at one point, the kind of scales are sort of really close and it's hard to tell. And then you're going to go past that. You know, if the question is, should I kill one person in order to save the entire Earth, then we've gone past that and the scales have tipped.
Okay, thanks. And hopefully none of those cases are ever actual.
Oh gosh. Oh, sorry. Oh no, I just broke my computer.
Dear.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well, but oh dear, that's serious.
I broke that, so I have a key. I basically just knocked it onto the kitchen floor and one of the keys fell out. I think might
We
be
can
okay.
all see and hear you very well.
Yeah,
so,
you
I just
didn't
hope the
have a
computer
kind of
was okay. Yeah.
you didn't have a kind of catastrophic
A little bit, but it was over very quickly. Yes.
Yeah.
Fiona, I think you had a question. As in Fiona Doherty.
Oh, that's a shame, Fiona. That's a disproportionate consequence, really. But I really enjoyed your talk. And I was especially interested in your trolley cases that you constructed. And how they I'd just like to hear more about how they'd interact with your sort of promoting of the two distinctions. So in particular, you know, imagine we alter it a bit and we take off one of the guys. So really the choice is now between, do you kill someone or do you make sure someone loses their arm? And again, you know, similarly to Bruce, this is just like sort of pushing at the limits of what things you can intend, even if the deontological distinctions have been laid down. So it gives me some insight what you were saying to Bruce, you know, you don't want to be absolutist about that. And that to me seems right, because especially if we want this to interact with, for example, areas of the law where you have things like manslaughter, which, you know, like hiring a hitman, that's still going to be frowned upon. Tripping and falling over and causing the man to trip and fall over and fall down in front of the cart, that's, the law has to make some sort of distinction between an accident and a manslaughter. On the other hand, it could be just reckless driving, something that had no intention towards a really tragic outcome, huge car, pileup, whatever. So sometimes when I'm just thinking, because the law doesn't work along those absolutist terms, that's also going to be another framework where you can that you can sort of interact with it. You want this stuff to apply, basically.
Good. Yeah, so the example that you gave of tripping and falling, now I think that's a really interesting example for showing how the distinctions kind of come apart. So in fact, if you just trip and fall, then it's neither foreseen nor strictly intended. Because it's not like, because you didn't foresee it, it's a pure accident. You could also have a case where you go, I'm late for my train. I know if I run for my train, I'm going to knock people over. I'm okay with that. And in that case, it's a side effect. It's merely foreseen. But it still seems wrong. And that's because even when we're at the kind of merely foreseen end, we still have questions about proportionality. So merely foreseen harm is easier to justify than strictly intended harm. But it's not, but you need to justify it. So you, in that case, you catching the train is not enough to justify knocking people over. If you were running to save a life, if you were running to catch somebody who was about to fall onto the train tracks, then you probably would be okay to run and possibly knock people over. They probably would just, they probably wouldn't die if you knock them over. So that seems okay. So you're kind of, we're always thinking about just like proportionality, that always matters. It's just, it would require more to justify. I'm kind of still going on this example. So imagine that it's not that you foresee that you're gonna knock people over. Instead, you kind of you need to use somebody as a springboard, which will kind of hurt them, and so you kind of push off their body, and then it seems that the harm is intended, strictly intended. And you'd need even more justification, I think, to justify doing that to save somebody else. So we always have these kind of there are quite a lot of different distinctions around, and proportionality always matters. In the cases where it's not even foreseen, where it's just you didn't even think about it, there I think we draw distinctions between what you've done and what you've merely allowed. Manslaughter can, I think, cover both, because it can cover cases where you had a responsibility and you didn't fulfill that responsibility, and that led to someone's death. So certainly the law sometimes recognizes cases of merely allowing harm as counting as manslaughter, I think. And certainly there are other kind of harms. child, so there is an offence to, I've forgotten the name of the offence, but it's to do with your children, and it includes either causing harm to them or not looking after them, not preventing harm to them. So sometimes the legal categories don't actually match up with the allowing categories, but I think they'll still be feeding in, because what we count as kind of rising to the level of kind of criminal will respond to these thoughts about the fact that it's harder to justify doing harm than allowing harm. And also, so my understanding is the legal categories tend to they respond to the strictly intended, merely foreseen, mostly. But they can include things which have doing and allowing in them.
Thanks, that's really helpful. That definitely seems right, because I think an interesting case for you might be the Alex Baldwin case. So he's been charged by, and I think specifically what you're saying, it lines up, it's with involuntary manslaughter. I'd need to know more about how they legally distinguish that, but the interesting thing there is I think they've also charged the woman who was in charge of the props. I don't know if that was also with involuntary manslaughter, but it was definitely with something like that. So that's very interesting. They're both getting charged. Obviously nobody foresaw such a horrible thing happening, but then there is that responsibility there, and that lines up with everything you've been saying. So yeah, that would be probably quite an interesting case study. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very interesting case. Thanks. Yeah.
We're just about to end soon, but could I get in a very quick question, which I probably should, because we're over the time. I wonder whether we should think some more. I mean, I've written about this, as has a colleague who's here today, Anthony McCarthy. I wonder whether we should think more about this combination between intentions and morally conclusive side effects. Because if you think about it, even the paradigmatic case of intentionally killing an innocent person, the innocence is normally foreseen rather than intended. So you don't go around looking for innocent people. You just kill this person who's in your way, who you know is innocent. And I wonder whether this kind of combination will help with things like using fat men or large people to block trolleys and so on, because you are intending something vis-a-vis his body, which you something actually of a kind you foresee will be fatal to him and of no benefit to him whatsoever. So I'm just wondering whether one way forward in these closeness situations is simply to combine some intentions and some morally conclusive foresights.
Yes. So Warren Quinn takes a route that's similar to that, and I think is probably the most promising intention-based account. So Quinn says that what's wrong is to intend to use somebody, so involve someone in your plans in a way that is foreseeably harmful to them. So it's exactly as you suggest, combining having an intention about them with foreseeing that it will be harmful to them. I do have worries, because we still have this sort of, does what you actually intend matter? So my own preference would be something a bit more similar to Francis Cam's approach, which is a sort of objective version. So Cam says what we need to ask is the harm justified? So any whenever we act in a way that harm comes to somebody else, something needs to be justified. And Cam says that you cannot justify harming somebody by a greater good, which they would be kind of a means to. So it's sort of about kind of looking at the actual objective structures that are supposed to kind of function in the relationships there would be between harms and potentially justifying goods. So I think some kind of combination of Cam and Quinn might be really, really helpful. But yeah, sorry, that was a very long-winded way of saying I agree. If we're happy to include intentions, then the suggestion you make, which Quinn fleshes out, is very promising. That's a paper called Actions, Intentions, Consequences: The Doctrine of Double Effect. He has two papers. He has one, Action, Intentions, Consequences: The Doctrine of Doing and Allowing, and Actions, Intentions, Consequences: The Doctrine of Double Effect, which is a very nice little kind of pair of papers.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona, for a very productive discussion. Yes, we really appreciate your doing this for us. And yes, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.